All right, today we're getting back to our PowerPoint over the Islamic Gunpowder Empire. This is the ones that you get the version chart over. So continue to take some notes, kind of round out that chart. That chart is going to be the last thing that you need to have in your notebook check on Friday. Grades this week. We are going to have an SAQ over this PowerPoint, over that chart. Make sure that you're adding in all this crazy stuff that's underlined, especially weird, terms and names like tribute, or later like the Devshirme. That is for a reason. We have an SAQ tomorrow. I may push back the due date until Thursday with pre-ACT and all, but yeah, it's coming up. And the way that you get points on your SAQs is by taking, these very specific terms, names, and people and places, things like, I don't know, the tributary system, and defining them, and then explaining how they kind of fit in with, this civilization or whatever. The main thing that's screwing people up on SAQs is they're just being vague. All right, you got to be specific. You got to use this specific academic vocabulary. So that's coming up. It'll be available tomorrow, but I'm probably not going to actually make it due until Thursday, just in case you're not here. Again, it's all good. On Friday, like I said, we do have our second notebook check. That is all that needs to be in there. Every one of those dates, the stuff associated with those dates, that's 20 points apiece. So if you're just missing one thing, it's not really the end of the world. If you're missing more than that, that's where it becomes problematic. Please get this in, get it in complete, get it in on time. It's a daily grade, but as you know, it also averages into your last test grade. So if you haven't turned in your first notebook check, which a few people haven't, I'll still accept that. But you got to get that in because, it's supposed to be the easy test grade, guys. So, take advantage of that. Speaking of test grades, we had a test last week. If you would like to retake it, if you got a failing grade on it, you need to stop by and talk to me about it. That way I can put you on the list or just email me. That's fine. Basically, what I'm going to do at the end of the day tomorrow on Wednesday, I'm going to stop taking those requests. But the people that did ask to retake it, I will open the test back up for you. And you'll have from Wednesday night all the way till Sunday night to get it done. So if you want to retake it, please talk to me. Please email me. Let me know. That way we can give you guys that opportunity. Finally, as far as grades go, the extra credit documentary review, that is due next Monday. The assignment itself is under yesterday's link. So please, take advantage of that if your grade is not where you want it to be. Last thing, and then we're teaching. AP exams. Man, you got to make that decision. If you want to take it, which you certainly should, you need to get your money into total registration by this Friday. Again, you need to be all filled up and filled out in total registration. You also have to have your AP classroom stuff set up as well, because if you're missing either one of those, they will not order your exam. So make sure you're doing all right with that. If you have questions about either one of those, please, at some point this week, stop by maybe the college and career readiness there, but stop by the counseling office. Talk to Miss Cordova. She's the one in charge of all that. She's the one that can really help you out. So, go and get those notebooks back out. Let's add into what we got. Where we left off, the Ottomans really asserted themselves. 1453 under Mehmed II. They had taken Constantinople, this super duper valuable trade city, and this really gave them a stranglehold on trade going into the Mediterranean, and specifically trade that's heading in the direction of Europe. They kind of get in cahoots with the Venetians, who they don't really like, but they form a partnership after a time, and that really just solidifies their monopoly on trade in the Mediterranean. So for the Ottomans and the Venetians, that's good news. They can jack up the prices on all these goods coming in via Silk Road or Indian Ocean trade or even Trans-Saharan trade. The bad news is for everybody else, especially for Western Europeans, everything they're going to get from now on is going to be way more expensive. And as Western Europe is very much Roman Catholic, they're going to be forced to buy from these very militaristic Muslims that they don't really like that much because, again, this is a time period of a lot of religious intolerance. I believe this is the picture that we closed out on. You've got Topkapi Palace there. That's where the sultans lived. Obviously, they had a decent amount of money to be able to live in that level of luxury. And pictured just to the side of it, you actually have the Bosphorus Strait. One side of the strait is Asia, the other side is Europe. I believe Turkey and Russia are the only two countries on both continents. Pretty interesting stuff. Today, we're going to talk about some weird stuff. We're going to talk about how the Ottomans staffed both their military and their government. We'll talk about kind of their social hierarchy. We'll talk about a bunch of kind of strange things that they did, some of which certainly led to their slow but steady decline. The Ottomans did something that most civilizations throughout history have done quite a bit. They used conscription to build up their military and their government. Who can tell me what conscription means? Now, I've literally asked this question probably 10 times, so I'm thinking hopefully a lot of you guys know it. I see 2 or 3 hands. Ropa, what's conscription? Exactamundo. It's kind of like being voluntold. The government says, hey, you're going to come out and you're going to work on this road like the Inca did, with the Midas system. Hey, you're going to come out and dig this canal or build this wall like the Chinese did with the Great Wall of China and the Grand Canal. You're going to come out and build these pyramids, like the Egyptians did. You're going to come and you're going to join the military, like almost every civilization's done at some point. The thing is, the Ottoman system of conscription was a little different than most. It was called the Dev Shirmeh. It's underlined, it's weird, it is worth writing down. To staff their military and their government, the Ottoman sultans used a selection system called the Dev Shirmeh, also known as a blood tax, essentially a form of human tribute payments. Through this system, Christian boys within the empire were recruited by force to serve the Ottoman government. Young boys were taken each year from conquered Christian lands in Europe and converted to Islam. They were then taught various skills in politics, the arts, and the military. So in these conquered territories, both the areas that the Ottomans completely controlled and also the areas on the outskirts that were kind of under a tributary system, the Ottomans would show up every year to these different towns, to these different cities, to these different villages, and they would require not money, not crops or something like that. They would require young boys. Okay, it's kind of weird. Well, that's where they're patriarchal, A. B, the things that they wanted for, especially like military service, because of their patriarchal views, they didn't think women were suitable for. Again, different times, it's messed up. I acknowledge that. This whole thing's really messed up. Well, because you're basically paying tax in human lives. This is something that you've got to give over as a sort of tax. You're not actually, here's a pint of blood. It's not on that level, but you're giving a person in a form of taxation. So they would take these young Christian boys from mainly Eastern Europe, like the Balkans. And they wanted them young because young children are a little bit more easily to mold and manipulate. So they would take these kids, they would convert them to Islam, because what choice did the kids have? And then they would, for lack of a better term, kind of brainwash them. They would condition them. They would teach them the skills that they needed to be effective government workers or to be effective in the military. They would really drive into their head their sole purpose was loyalty to the Ottomans, loyalty specifically to the Sultan. This is how they staffed their government bureaucracy, a lot of the jobs in their government. This is how they staffed a lot of positions in their military. If you were a kid that was a little bit more, academic, I guess you could say, you were probably going the government route. If you were a kid, though, that was a little bit more physically adept, maybe better at committing acts of violence, if you were tougher, I guess, you would go the military route. And a lot of those kids ended up forming actually the elite forces of the Ottoman military, the Janissary Corps, the Janissary. Write that down as well. It's weird, okay, because these are essentially slave soldiers because they don't have much of a choice. But because they've been conditioned from such a young age, they don't necessarily see themselves that way. They were given some of the most prestigious positions in the military. They were seen as some of the most effective fighters. They even were prized so much for their loyalty that the Janissaries were used also as the personal guard of the Sultan himself. It is incredibly weird and deranged. There's no kinda here. But, for some Christians living in Eastern Europe, because the Ottomans didn't treat Christians super great. We'll get to that later. This was actually seen by some parents as, hey, you know what, I'm losing my kid and they're going to be kind of brainwashed and all that stuff. But really, this may be better for them. This may give them a path towards upward mobility. Because even though these were slaves of the state, they were slave soldiers, they also managed to rise to very powerful and prominent positions and could have a pretty good life if things worked out that way. Again, it's a weird system, the devshirme, that they would use, essentially slaves as their government workers, as a lot of their military forces. But the Ottomans for many years found a way to make it work. So I guess that indoctrination process, by and large, pretty successful. One historical figure that was kind of sort of involved in some of this, who would have been kind of sort of the victim of some of this, but who rebelled, becomes very famous, becomes very infamous. I believe we maybe mentioned him the other day. His name is Vlad Tepes III, aka Vlad the Impaler, aka Vlad Dracul, aka, how many times can I say aka? AKA Dracula. Yes, Dracula is involved with the Ottomans. He grew up with Mehmed II, the guy that conquered Constantinople. We're going to watch a little video, and I'll go a little bit more in depth because there's some completely deranged things that the video leaves out. But he was essentially a prince in one of the areas. I think at that point hadn't been completely taken over by the Ottomans, but they were under a tributary system of the Ottomans. And he ends up getting taken by the Ottomans and has to live with them for many years. He's kind of like a hostage. Not quite going through the devshirme because he's more of a prominent hostage type individual. But eventually he's freed. He goes home and stuff goes kind of wild. So we're going to watch a little video over him. And again, kind of look at the video through the context of what we talked about. This devshirme, the Ottomans taking over a lot of Christian land.
Today featuring Vlad the Impaler
in Eastern Europe. And again, pretty interesting individual. We're just going to hit the high notes, but if you ever want to do some truly deranged reading, check into this guy.
Today featuring Vlad the Impaler, an inspiration for the legendary vampire Count Dracula and a voivod with a truly bloody biography. Vlad's father, Vlad, ruled Wallachia as the voivod, which was a prince or duke. Wallachia was at the time under Ottoman imperial control. Vlad was called Dracul, which meant devil or dragon. The title comes from the chivalric order of the dragon, which was kind of a who's who of Christian European monarchs of the 1400s, of which Vlad was a member. Dracula means son of the devil or dragon. When young Vlad was just 11, he was taken hostage by the Ottoman Empire with his father and brother Radu. His father was released, but the other two remained in captivity for 7 years, learning much about their enemy. Near the end of this time, Dracula's father, who was at war with Hungary, was betrayed by the boyars, the aristocracy, and killed. The Ottoman Empire decided to send Vlad to his homeland to take the throne. The Hungarians were against this, though, and after just 2 months, Dracula fled to Moldavia, and his second cousin Vladislav then reigned. After 7 years of that, those same Hungarians felt Vladislav was getting too friendly with the Ottomans, whose power was growing and who had recently taken Constantinople. So, Vlad got the throne again, and this time, he was not going to give it up, and it was time for revenge. The Easter feast from 1457 is like something straight out of Game of Thrones. Dracula invited 500 boyars to that feast, seized them, and had them impaled. You are still alive when you're impaled. For a while. Because of this and his reign of terror, he got the name the Impaler. He also refused to pay taxes to the Sultan, stating that if he has to pay, the Ottoman subjects in his lands must remove their turbans. When they refused, Dracula had the turbans nailed to their heads. The empire quickly responded. In the spring of 1462, Sultan Mehmed II and 200,000 soldiers attacked Wallachia. Along with Mehmed came Vlad's brother Radu, who had converted to Islam. Dracula lost the battle. He then decided to burn the southern part of his country and poison the wells. He knew the Ottoman army quite well and tried to turn their invasion into a nightmare. Wallachian guerrillas staged sneak attacks on the enemy. Dracula dressed in Ottoman costume and organized a night attack that set fire to Mehmed's tent. In the morning, the Turks fought each other trying to find the imposter. Still though, they marched on till they reached the capital. There they saw a forest of stakes with 20,000 rotting bodies impaled on them. It was real proof that Dracula was the son of the devil. Mehmed returned to his empire, and Dracula was betrayed by the Hungarians and captured by King Matthias Corvinus. He spent 14 years in prison before being released on condition that he convert from Orthodox Christianity to Catholicism. Once on the throne again, he remained there for less than a year. One theory says that he was killed by his own men, another that he was killed by an assassin. His head was sent to Istanbul, where it was, you guessed it, impaled on a stake. A few hundred years later, the life of that Wallachian voivod inspired Bram Stoker to create the legendary vampire, Dracula. Let us know what you think in the comment.
Okay, so let's just kind of unpack this just a little bit, because he's an interesting character, if not completely strange. So, his father was essentially the king of Wallachia, who at this time was kind of under the subjugation of the Ottomans. I want to say at this time they hadn't been thoroughly directly conquered, but they were definitely in that tributary system. So the father, Vlad, his brother Radu, they basically are abducted. And even though the father gets to go back home and rule in the Ottomans' name, Vlad and his brother Radu, they're held hostage by the Ottomans for years and years and years. So he would have went through some of this military training, would have went through some of the Dev Shirmeh brainwashing. His brother actually converts to Islam, but he never really does. Father dies, he's sent back home to rule essentially in the Ottomans' name. And he almost immediately starts, kind of getting into some stuff. He kills a lot of the nobility that he thinks were kind of responsible for his father's downfall. The Ottomans come to collect tribute, and he nails the turbans that the Ottomans are wearing, nails it to their heads. Then he directly starts fighting the Ottomans, okay? And this is just all in the video. So imagine you're leading this Ottoman army, okay? And you got to go respond. You got to go deal with this guy, this traitor who's just messing with your turf in your mind. And you roll up to his border, and you come from the distance, and it's got to look like a forest, right? Like, man, they got a heck of a forest right here on the border. But you get closer and you realize it's tens of thousands of human beings that have been impaled and have been there for weeks, maybe months, maybe just days, who knows? Now, this is gross. Let me preface it by saying it's about as gross as it gets. But I think you need to understand the realities of impalement, because when you hear what this is, I mean, it looks bad, but it doesn't look nearly as bad as it really is. Here to the right, you've got a picture of, Vlad kind of eating supper amongst some impaled bodies, which he supposedly did a lot. He was kind of crazy. But when you impale someone back then, you would take this large wooden pole, you would shove it up the rear of a person, that's about as appropriate as I can get, while they're alive. You would shove it up pretty far, but not far enough to kill them, and then you would stake them into the ground. Then, over the next several hours, their weight and gravity would just force the pole further and further and further in to where it eventually would emerge out the mouth or maybe even poke through the back of the neck. You're alive that whole time. That is one of the absolute worst ways to die. And this guy did it to so many tens of thousands of people, he got the nickname the Impaler. So you come across this force of the impaled. He did that because he's obviously sadistic and has some mental health issues probably, but also he knew that's going to scare anyone that comes across him. So that's where he gets this real terrible reputation, this real evil reputation. There's other stuff that he supposedly did, like when he first returned to take power, he came through this town, and again, these are stories, some of them maybe not fully true. But he came to this town, and I guess they had a crop failure or something, and people there were just starving. Everybody there, most of the people were impoverished. People had lost their homes. There was a lot of beggars in the street. I mean, people were literally starving to death. And Vlad's like, we can't have this. I can't have my people struggling and starving. Let's go over to the town hall. I'm going to whip you guys up an awesome feast. Everything's going to be hunky-dory. And he has them all put into the hall, and then they lock the doors and they set the building on fire. Again, he got rid of his homeless population. Not the nicest thing to do. Supposedly, this scene, this grisly scene where he's eating amongst the forest of the impales, which he supposedly liked to do. Supposedly, he also liked to take like his bread and dip it into a little saucer of blood and eat it. Hence where the whole vampire thing comes from. Now, vampires don't start with Dracula. Vampires in like Eastern European folklore are pretty popular. The reason that in the vampire stories they stake them in the heart is people used to, when they would bury someone, they would stake them inside the ground. That way they couldn't rise from the dead. So it's not like these stories hadn't been around before. But when Bram Stoker was looking to write, a vampire story back in the 1800s, he looked through history to kind of find someone to base it on. And he found Old Vlad. How you get Dracula. That's how you get the most famous vampire story ever. Again, was he a vampire? He wasn't a vampire, but he was probably worse than a vampire because he was a psycho. That being said, you go to Romania to this day, much like if you went to Mongolia and they say Genghis Khan's awesome, they think Vlad Tepes is a national hero because he stood up against the Muslim invaders and he protected Eastern Orthodox Christianity and he protected his homeland. So again, we look at all these figures, and me, I look at him, this guy's evil, but it's all perspective. Everybody from different, cultures, they're going to view individuals in quite different ways based on where they come from, based on how they grew up. So there's old Vlad Tepes again. He probably grew up with Mehmed the Conqueror. He was definitely involved in some of that in a small way, but a pretty interesting way. Probably not going to show up on the AP exam, but still, interesting to learn about. The most famous of all the Ottoman sultans, the one whose name I really want you to know, is Suleiman the Magnificent. If you ever get a question at all over a Ottoman sultan, it's going to be this guy. Suleiman I, Suleiman the Magnificent, nicknamed Suleiman the Lawgiver because he reformed the legal system to kind of greater unify the empire. This guy was renowned as an awesome sultan. He did things to legitimize his authority. And he did the same things that people throughout history do to legitimize their authority and build their legend, to get names like the Magnificent. First, he conquered a lot of territory, probably more than any other Ottoman sultan. Conquered lands in Europe, Asia, Africa, including Syria, modern-day Israel, Egypt, Hungary, Croatia, Romania, fully subjugating the area that Vlad was under. He built up his navy to further dominate Mediterranean trade. He actually marched his armies as far as Austria, Vienna, which is pretty far into Western Europe. They didn't win. They ended up having to turn around, but still, that's one of the things that really scared, the Western Europeans, how dominant and how far this force of the Ottomans could go. But he also did other things. He built a lot, built hundreds of mosques, including the one that you see pictured there. He built forts. He built other great buildings. And again, that's what a lot of leaders do to not only be remembered by, but also to assert their authority. So people say, look at all these great things that this person's doing that they can have done. I mean, that is why they call him the Magnificent. That being said, pretty interesting, and this is true of a lot of sultans, he was never supposed to be the sultan, okay? In the Ottoman Empire, it wasn't like automatic that power was going to pass to the oldest son, but that's usually what happened. Suleiman was like the third oldest, and he really wanted to be sultan. So he did what any rational person would do. He just murdered all of his brothers, like every one of them, and he had like 5 or 6. Murdered them all, and he was the only one left, so he got to be the sultan. This actually becomes a tradition. Right, like the Mongols, again, there was no real clear line of succession, so they fought a lot for who was going to be the Khan. Not so much in the Ottoman Empire. So here's how it would usually work. The Ottoman Sultan would usually kind of pick a successor. Usually, sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. The person that either got picked, or the person that just became Sultan, or the person that just really wanted to be Sultan, they would preemptively murder all of their siblings. That way, there was nobody left to challenge for their authority. So let's say, things are going good. Ha ha ha. I know I'm going to be the Sultan, but that'll be years from now. Middle of the night, dad has a heart attack. That new Sultan probably going to send people to murder all of his siblings that night while they sleep. We're talking 10-year-olds. We're talking 10-month-olds. We're talking all dead. And because of that, they never really had any civil wars. It was always very clear who was in charge, because by the time it was solidified who the Sultan really was, everybody else that could be Sultan was dead. So they had almost this state-sponsored tradition of murdering your siblings once you took over or a little bit before you took over. Really, really weird. Yes?
Well, like, also, wasn't family, like, not as big of a deal? Like, it was more just your parents were just the people who gave birth to you, and, like, their family ties weren't as close as...
You probably have a really good point there. I mean...
I find it very hard to believe that anybody
could consciously
could
do that.
consciously, like, murder them themselves.
But like also the time period.
Right, that's what I'm saying. It's like,
I would.
Well, you gotta do what you gotta do. And also, if you know that if you don't murder them first, they're probably gonna murder you, that may give you a little bit more incentive. But it also gets into something else we're gonna talk about. A lot of these sultans had countless number of kids. They had tens of wives. They had all sorts of girlfriends and sex slaves and all sorts of stuff. So there were a bunch of kids that, yeah, you're right, you probably wouldn't have been all that close to anyway. Plus, I mean, the Sultan, especially if he's got, say, 15 wives now, how well does he really know his kids? He probably has a relationship with some of them he doesn't. So you're right, there probably was very much a different sort of family dynamic. And maybe in that historical context, maybe it wasn't as difficult a decision as it would be for you in the middle of the night to go and cut your brother's throat or something.
Because if you don't talk about first,
Yeah.
and I feel like I'd rather just be a Sultan.
Well, but think about it like this. If this had been going on for years and years, and you know that one day this is going to happen, pretty much from birth, you're thinking, how am I going to kill these guys?
if you're not dead by
Yeah.
the time you're...
Well, exactly. If you make it to the point that you have that sort of rational thought, it's like, I know when the old man kicks it, somebody's going to be coming to kill me. So I got to figure out how to kill these people first. And that would probably kind of negate any sort of really good relationship you would have with them, because you would always be thinking,
How am I going to kill you?
exactly, how am I going to kill you before you kill me? I know, it's weird, but history's weird, guys. We're going to get into some really weird stuff here in a second. Hadn't even gotten to the weird stuff. Ottoman rulers forced people in occupied areas to pay tribute. We talked about that. But there was also some other weird facets of the economy that we need to discuss, such as the Ottomans' unique system of tax collection known as the iltizam. Iltizam, I'd write that down. You can also put off to the side, sometimes it's just called tax farming. So again, in some of the areas on the outskirts, they were still, operating the tributary system. In other areas, they were more traditionally just taxing their citizens. But after a while, I guess to free up government workers, I don't really understand the motivation myself. They would basically auction off the job of tax collector in different regions to where people could go in, they could kind of bid on it. Like, yeah, I want to be the tax collector. And the reason people did it is they could get pretty rich off of it, especially if they were kind of shady. Essentially, once these private individuals earned that job, bought that job, essentially, they would go to their local regions, wherever they were responsible for. They would collect the taxes. They would keep a certain, agreed upon percentage for themselves, and they would forward the rest to the central government. The problem is, after years and years, people figured out, well, instead of 10%, maybe I'll keep 30%. And maybe I'll tell these guys, instead of the taxes being this much, I'll just tell them it's this much. And then I'll keep the rest. So you can kind of see how a system like that, where maybe it was designed to kind of free up some of the jobs that the government had to do, it's going to lead to a lot of corruption. It was not a good move. And that's just one of the many little things that started to happen to the Ottoman empires, really after the rule of Suleiman the Magnificent. It's kind of going downhill like that. But that's one of the things that kind of led to instability and corruption and ultimately their downfall. The Ottomans were still doing all right. They were dominating Mediterranean trade. They got into cahoots with the Venetians, who, really kind of, that partnership let them monopolize trade. but it also ticked a lot of people off. I mean, some European nations like France, they signed trade agreements, but others are like, to heck with you guys. Yeah, go ahead. We got to figure out a different way of doing things. That's how you get the age of exploration, guys. That's the whole beginnings of it. We don't want to deal with these aggressive militant Muslims and the Venetians who are jacking up the prices on everything coming from the East, all these luxury goods we want. Because at this point, Western Europe, they're linked back in, but not directly. They've always had to deal with middlemen. And now those middlemen, being the Ottomans, they don't like them, and things are more expensive. And there's also that religious difference, lots of religious intolerance back then. So that's really how you start to see the age of exploration begin. Technology's better, the compass has traveled from the east, ship design's getting better anyway. Let's go out there and try to find better routes to Asia, to Indian Ocean trade, so we can directly access it and cut out the middlemen that we don't like. That's what it's all about. There are two countries at the cutting edge, at the forefront of the age of exploration. Do you guys know who they were? Spain and? Not France, they come later. Not the UK, they come later. Not Italy, they come later. Britain, UK, they come later. Italy never really gets involved with it because they're making money already off trade, so they don't have to. No. It is the next door neighbor to Spain, and they're the first. Portugal. Okay, so here's how it is. Portugal is not very big, okay? If they were going to expand, they had to look overseas anyway. They start to get the idea, you know what, we're going to get into this. They've got a ruler who's big into, sailing and navigation. They say, you know what, we're going to invest in this. We're going to build good ships. We're going to train people to go out and do this. They were the first ones to set sail around Africa. No one had ever been to the tip of Africa, the southern tip. So they are the first ones that go around. They get directly linked into Indian Ocean trade. Then they can directly go to places like India and China and Indonesia and all those places with the luxury goods. That's how they start to make money. They build like trading posts throughout. We call them the trading post empire. We'll get to that later. The Spanish, they go another way. And this kind of is, at the behest of Christopher Columbus. It says, hey, going around Africa, that's going to take way too long. That's crazy. I'm just going to sail to the west. I'll pop out. I'll be in China in no time. He ends up in the Americas. Doesn't realize it at first, but eventually they figure out, hey, we're not in India. Guys, that's the beginning, all right? And what you see because of that is a change in the world forever. European countries like French and England and the Dutch and a few others, they start investing in exploration. They start colonizing overseas. They start getting really, really rich off of it, getting all the resources. And out of that wealth, they can then afford to build up their militaries. They can build up their navies to make trade even better. They can start investing in modernization, new technology. Eventually, you get the Industrial Revolution. The rest is history. Whereas the Ottomans don't really ever do that. They kind of stick with what they have at a certain point. And that's really what's their downfall. They don't modernize. They don't colonize. They don't do all the things that the Europeans are doing. And while the Europeans are on the upswing, the Ottomans just kind of start to stagnate. But again, why are the Europeans doing this? It all goes back to the Ottomans. It all goes back to that conquest of Constantinople in 1453, kind of forcing their hands and making them look for other ways to get to Asia. I know, it's weird, but history, it's like a series of dominoes. Now, this is weird, but man, the Ottomans probably popularized coffee houses, if that means anything. Coffee at this point, it's been around for a while, but it's just at this point really getting popular. And coffee houses kind of get this reputation as places where, business deals can get done and people can interact and talk ideas and talk politics. Kind of similar to what you see today. I've been on a few job interviews, meeting people at like Starbucks. I wasn't applying for Starbucks. I was applying somewhere else. But somebody's like, yeah, meet me at Starbucks. It's just, it's this natural place where people can sit and converse and they can enjoy a beverage. And that's a tradition that kind of goes back to this time period, as weird as it seems. Every society has social classes. The Ottomans were, of course, no different. What time do we get out of here? 40. Oh, okay, we're doing fine. The Ottomans are no different. At the top of their society, they've got kind of this warrior aristocracy. They've got a class of Islamic scholars known as the ulama. The Janissaries, those Christian slave soldiers, actually get elevated to very high positions, so they gain some power and influence. And you've got these really strong advisors to the sultans known as viziers. That's a good term to know. The viziers.
That's what Jafar is.
I know. Yeah, he is, isn't he? I believe he was the Grand Vizier, if I wasn't mistaken. I haven't seen that in so long. But the Grand Viziers, and I think this is probably true of Aladdin because it's been so long since I've seen it. But you get to a certain point with some of these sultans, and this happens in a lot of empires, especially when the wrong people inherit the throne, that a lot of these emperors, a lot of these sultans, they get to the point that they're so concerned with living in luxury and hanging out with their wives and girlfriends and doing stuff like that, that they're more concerned with that sort of power and that luxury than actually governing. So in the later years, a lot of the actual power to government, it really rules to these advisors, like the Grand Vizier. They're the ones doing the day-to-day governing, and sometimes they can get kind of greedy and corrupt in their own right, and that in and of itself creates instability.
That's literally the whole plot of Aladdin.
Boom. There you go. Well, told you. That was all somewhat kind of sort of historically accurate. We've already said the Ottomans were very patriarchal, and we're about to get into some really messed up stuff, guys, so forgive me. But they did find ways to exert a fair amount of power and influence through a phenomenon we call harem politics. Harem politics. A good example, in the 1500s, 1600s, they call that the Sultanate of Women, meaning there were different women behind the scenes that while they weren't the Sultan, they were the ones really in charge because they were whispering in the Sultan's ears. So there's two I got to go over, and they're both really messed up. And again, they speak to the patriarchy of the Ottomans and kind of just patriarchy that we see throughout history. It's one of those continuities through most of history. Women are treated terribly. And you can't justify that. You can't rationalize it. It's just really messed up. But it's something that we can't entirely ignore. It's just history's deranged sometimes. And these are two very deranged things that the Ottomans were into. People have heard the term harem before, right? They may have even used the term harem in Aladdin. I don't really remember. Does anybody know what a harem is? Was this in Aladdin?
No, but it's
Okay.
it's in a different.
It's in a different movie. Okay, tell me what a harem is.
Isn't it like a group of women who all love the same person?
Well, kind of. They may not really love him,
Right, like a group of women who
but
all
yes.
surround one.
Yeah. So like the sultans would have tens, sometimes dozens, sometimes more of wives. People they were married to. Yes, it's the term for that group of women, and also kind of where they stay is sometimes. They would have a lot of different wives. They would also have a lot of what we call concubines. Has anybody ever heard the term concubine? You hear it a lot. It's present a lot in history, but it's really messed up. It's essentially a sex slave. It's a woman in this circumstance that is their job, and sometimes they're treated well by the Sultan or the Emperor or whatever, but they don't have any choice. Okay, they are a sex slave. Okay, really messed up. Well, where harem politics comes in is, the Sultan having all these wives and girlfriends, he's going to have a lot of kids. He's going to have his favorites. And those favorites, they're gonna gain a lot of power over the Sultan. They're going to be able to whisper in his ear, hey, I know I'm like your fifth wife, but you should really promote my son. You should favor my son. You should actually spend time with my son, maybe groom him to be the next Sultan. Sometimes the girlfriends, sometimes the sex slaves were doing the same things. And in doing so, they kind of became the puppet masters at certain points, at least during this time period. Yeah, go ahead. So women did have influence, but it was in really messed up ways. Another group that gained influence, and this is another strange term that we do have to go over, were eunuchs. Has anybody ever heard the term eunuch? You probably heard it, but you may not know what it means. Okay, so we've already talked about enough gross stuff. Let's just keep rolling with it. Eunuchs, and you see this a lot in the Ottoman Empire, you see it in Chinese history, you see it in several cultures' histories. But these are essentially slaves who, as young boys, had all of their genitals removed. Yeah, let that soak in. Now, in the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs kind of got this reputation as kind of being schemers because they were typically the harem guards. They were the ones that were hanging out with the sultan's girlfriends and wives, making sure no other guys came around and messed with them. So inevitably, these eunuchs, they start becoming friends with the wives, friends with the girlfriends, friends with the people that have a lot of power and influence. And during this whole Sultanate of Women period, the reputation at least was that, the girlfriends and the wives and the eunuchs, they were all scheming behind the scenes, really making all these kind of weird power plays. Again, it's kind of strange, but you will hear the term eunuch again. The whole idea is, you're taking this young man and doing terrible things, but you're also subjugating them, you're emasculating them, you're making sure they're never going to have a family, theoretically, so there's no one or nothing else to be loyal to except for you, which again seems kind of deranged, but then you get back into kind of the brainwashing, the indoctrination, the really molding these young people from a very early age to do whatever you want. As far as social classes go, just kind of rounding this out, you have your merchants, you had your artisans. At the bottom, you've got your peasants, and you do have a large number of slaves. Slavery was very common in the Ottoman Empire. Christians and Jews, we do need to talk about this. The Ottomans sometimes get a reputation for being very tolerant. And for the day, I guess kind of sort of they were. Like when Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, start essentially Spain and force out the last of the Muslim influences, they also kick out everybody else who's not Roman Catholic. They force all the Jews out of their territory. In Western Europe, there was a lot of religious intolerance at the time. If you weren't Roman Catholic, get out or bad things are going to happen to you. In the Ottoman Empire, Christians and Jews, at least, you could live there. They weren't going to make you convert, but they were not going to treat you as equals either. First, you had to pay the jizya. And this is a continuity we see with most Muslim empires with Christians and Jews. You got to pay very high taxes. That's kind of like your penalty for not belonging to the dominant faith. But you're also a second-class citizen. You don't have the same rights as everybody else. Weird little things like, if you live next to a Muslim, your house can be bigger. If you're riding a horse and you see a Muslim walking along, you had to get down off the horse and kind of bow your head because you can never look down on a Muslim. Lots of jobs, lots of opportunities you just weren't going to have. So on one hand, were they tolerant? Yeah, compared to some other places of the time, especially in Western Europe. But that doesn't mean that people were necessarily treated equally either. And as time progresses, especially as we get into the early 1900s, they get considerably less tolerant and more persecutorial. It's not even a word, persecutorial. Persecuting. They're not nice. That's what I'm looking for. Now, this is just an overview on the decline because we're going to get back to this later because they are around until, like I said, World War I. 1571, after the death of Suleiman the Magnificent, you start to see a slow and steady decline. And I'm not going to read this all word for word, but there's a lot of things that go on. 1600s, they're not fighting a whole lot of wars. It's a relative peaceful time, so they kind of start to stagnate militarily. They're not advancing at the same rate as other European nations who got all that cash rolling in from overseas colonization. You start to see, that harem politics, the scheming women and eunuchs and grand viziers kind of eat away at power. You start to see some not good sultans. And you just see them being more and more slow to reform, more and more reliant on slavery and coerced labor, less and less tolerant. And this sort of trend continues all the way until World War I, where they fight as a part of the Central Powers. They lose on that side, and because of that, they lose their empire. What they're left with is Turkey today. But this was going on for such a long time period. It was such a slow but steady decline that they get a nickname that you really need to know. The sick man of Europe. You need to know that. The sick man of Europe. There have been questions on AP exams before where they're talking about the Ottomans. They never say the word Ottoman at all. They're talking about the sick man of Europe. And again, if you would have known that, hey, that's the Ottomans we're talking about, You would have gotten that question right. It's one of those things. We're going to go back to the Ottomans. We're going to talk about them, not a whole bunch, but they will come back up again because they're going to be around all the way up until the 20th century. So, as we move through the rest of 1450 to 1750, then 1750 to 1900, then even a little bit after 1900, they're there. But no, really, after the late 1500s, they are kind of on the downhill slide. Tomorrow, we are going to finish. We may not watch any videos other than maybe one. I don't know. We'll have to see if we have time. But we're going to do the Safavid. We'll finish them in like 5 minutes because I got 2 slides. And honestly, the Safavids, you just need to know kind of that they were there. We will spend more time on the Mughals. But again, the Mughals are going to be around for a while. So we'll talk about them in a little bit more depth moving onward, especially when the British start to go in and take over. That doesn't happen until the 1800s, but we'll get there. But we should be able to finish the Safavid and the Mughals tomorrow. I'm going to open up the SAQ tomorrow. If there's time in class, maybe we'll do it. But it is probably going to be something that we do for homework. But I'll probably make that due on Thursday instead of tomorrow, just because I know some people are going to be out pre-ACT. Friday, notebook check. Please get that done. Get it in on time. That could help you out a lot. Test corrections, retakes, that could help you out a lot. Let me know if you want to retake it. Extra credit, of course, could help you out a lot. That's the whole reason we're doing it. So just know, we're getting there to the tail end. There's still things you can do. But every day, that opportunity is getting a little less and less. So be proactive. We got about, 4 minutes left. Let's hang loose. Talk slowly. Do what you got to do.
The election season is here. Remember, please vote for a secret, but whether you vote is public information. After this election, your voting record will be updated, and your friends and family will be able to look up how often you vote. So vote on or by November 3rd.
Today featuring Vlad the Impaler.
I found one.